You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. With the help of a wide range of guests, we examine how war and peace are experienced in different periods and places, and we discuss the world-building impact which representations of conflict and its aftermath can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice König, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. My guest today is Dr. Florence Gaub, Director of the Research Division at the NATO Defence College in Rome. A security expert and futurist, she has held key positions such as Deputy Director at the EU Institute for Security Studies, Foresight Advisor at the EU Council, and Special Advisor to EU Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič. Beginning her career at NATO's Middle East faculty in 2009, Florence now focuses on strategic foresight and geopolitical trends. Her publications include the bestseller Zukunft, eine Bedienungsanleitung, published in 2023 but soon to be published again in English as Future, a Manual. Also the EU's Global Trends to 2030, published in 2019, and the Cauldron, NATO's Libya operation in 2018. Florence serves on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Complex Risks and is a member of the World Science Fiction Society, and last year she published a graphic novel, NATO 2099, which we're going to talk about among other topics today. So Florence, thank you very much for making time to talk to me about futures thinking, its challenges and also creative approaches to it, and welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start, if I may, just with a bit of context. It would be fantastic if you could begin by telling our listeners what the remit of the research division at the NATO Defence College is. What do you do and why?
I especially like the why part, not often asked actually. The NATO Defence College is the Alliance's premier educational institution. So, most member states have their own educational institutions. And then from the rank of colonel onwards, they can also join the senior course here at the college, which is a 6-month strategic level course and prepares officers for functions within NATO or in their member states related to NATO. And it's, a strategic course, really. And the college does that since 1951. Were created by Eisenhower, who said the Alliance needs one such institution because it's not just about education, but also cohesion building because, they create a network. A course can have 80 to 90 course members, so that's a huge network. And then since 2005, more or less, we also have a research division in this college, which looks at, obviously, as the name indicates, doing research on NATO relevant issues. But we're not alone in NATO's thinking universe. So, you have a good division of labor between those thinking about immediate things like NATO headquarters, you have policy planning unit, and you have Office of Net Assessment and so forth. They're really thinking about, the immediate future. And then you have Allied Command Transformation, and they're thinking about the distant future in 20 years. They're also looking at mostly the probable future because their futures serve as a basis for decision making, purchases, recruitment decisions and so forth. And we fit into this by looking at futures that are 2 to 5 years away. And most of the time, we'll talk about the comic in a second, but also at the improbable future. So we're looking at weak signals. We're constantly looking at what are the others not thinking about, what are we overlooking, what are surprise elements, and so forth. And I think that is our contribution to improving NATO preparedness, readiness. It's particularly interesting when you think about the future of war. Research is very clear on that we're not good at seeing the outline of the future of war coming. So we always need to think about adaptation. We need to challenge our own thinking to get better at what's actually, what might happen and how to respond to it. So why do we do it? Because what we do is existential. So you need to be prepared for it. And also it will never be what you think it's going to be. So how do you work around that? And that is our contribution.
Thank you. That's a really helpful description there of how you fit in within NATO more broadly, and this emphasis on some very short-term futures planning, 2 to 5 years, the immediate future, but also this improbable futures and the challenges around researching and planning for and predicting and imagining these improbable futures. As you say, the future that comes is never the future that we're anticipating. So you and I met last October when I attended the NATO's Allied Foresight Conference at the Defence College, and I was struck there by the efforts that you had made to bring lots of different kinds of experts together, military and civilian, to consider these improbable futures and security challenges that might arise from them. So what different kinds of research does your team aim to pull together, and how has that changed over the past decade? Do we need new kinds of research today to meet new kinds of challenges?
The short answer is yes. Policy relevant research, in contrast to, let's say, purely academic research, really has the task to improve policymaking or improve decision making by, finding new options, by adapting to the really current challenges. So as much as I love pure academia, our role is really to look at what is on our policymakers' minds and how can we improve their choices or how many choices they have. How can we help them think about new challenges, perhaps test a policy idea and so forth. So it goes without saying that, 10 years ago, it was a completely different time. I think, of course, we had already Crimea, but I think NATO as a collective was still very much focusing on Afghanistan, on partnership, crisis management. So it was, NATO 2.0 in that sense. Now we're in NATO 3.0. And so, of course, research has changed quite a bit since then. Of course, Russia was always a research interest for NATO, and that has been, galvanized. So that's still the case. But actually, I will say with a different direction. Russia now as a much stronger opponent, but also, what's interesting from a research point of view, research has changed when it comes to Russia because we don't have as much access as we used to have. My researchers can no longer travel to Russia. Russia is also trying to close off its internet. Even where you could call friends in Russia, maybe they won't talk to you anymore over the phone. So we have a real research challenge now when it comes to doing research on Russia, just no access to information and data. So it means we have to change direction a little bit. So that has changed. I also will say, of course, we have classical emerging technologies that we didn't have 10 years ago, such as drones. But drones is almost no longer as interesting because it's expected. And we are working more here in the research division on the unexpected. So we are looking at, for instance, a super new field that I discovered in Davos, biology becoming perhaps a military domain because thanks to AI, the development of pathogens, but also of vaccines is going to evolve super fast. We also know that Russia, for instance, doesn't have the same hang-ups as we do about, attacking food or water supply. So this is something that definitely we didn't think about 10 years ago. And in terms of what you said about the diversity, when you're in the business of searching for weak signals, so a new development that might have far-reaching consequences, you have to look where nobody else is looking. So if I was just sitting in a room with people that are just like myself, it's unlikely I'm going to discover something I didn't know. And that's why, we love working with people from completely different countries, different sectors, private sector. I love talking to insurance companies because, of course, they're looking at this with different eyes, but they're also searching constantly for new developments. And I think it's super enriching. And it's also, for an academic with an inquisitive mind, it's also great fun.
Yes, and I remember at the conference, you were bringing in private sector firms who are themselves trying to develop strategies in the face of very rapidly changing global and indeed national circumstances. So yes, these weak signals looking where no one else is looking is a really useful way of putting it. So you obviously spend a huge amount of time thinking about and indeed briefing on complex risks and security challenges. Our listeners are aware that we are living through a time of great upheaval with, major shifts in global order and combined, as you've said already, with fast-paced technological developments and then the existential threats of climate change and so on. Do you think every generation ends up feeling that the world as they know it is changing beyond recognition, or are we actually facing a particularly acute period of unprecedented transformation?
I think the answer is a bit of both. I mean, not every generation of humanity has been through a lot of changes because until technology and, also change in thinking with the Enlightenment, basically the notion of change really arrives only in the 19th century, in the human future, let's put it that way, right? So before that, even though you had a great deal of uncertainty at the individual level, say you had no idea that life expectancy was a thing in the Middle Ages, you didn't know what the weather forecast was going to be. Should you contract some kind of bacteria, you were dead pretty fast, but you had no way of knowing when or how that's going to happen. So I think individual uncertainty was much greater in the old days than it is today. But politically, there was a lot more certainty because you didn't have democracy, which is in itself a system of change. You didn't have technology, which introduces change. You didn't have all these underpinnings that create, on the one hand, really great things for us, but also create a lot of uncertainty. So let's say uncertainty was born in the 19th century. I will say every generation has its mega challenges and perceives them as absolute. So, for instance, I remember I was in New York during September 11. we were horrified and terrified. And at the time, we had no idea, what was going to happen. I remember the worst case scenarios were, like global conflict, pitting Islam against Christianity everywhere and so forth. So we were very scared. But then, old fears, they disappear. It's like you delete them from your database because there is no utility. So in other words, nostalgia is a neurological phenomenon that we all have. And that's why we always believe the past was better than the present. That said, so with all the nuance, there's a brilliant book for the people. Actually, no, it's also available in English, but in German it's called Republik der Angst. In English, that would translate as Republic of Fear, but I think the English title is German Angst, by Frank Bies, B-I-E-S-S. He explains how Germany, for instance, every decade there's a dominant fear, a very pronounced dominant fear in German society. So reading that, I realized Germans, for instance, are always scared of something. It's just the nature and the extent changes. Now, what we're living through right now, of course, even though we're not the first to go through a period of upheaval, it still feels very stressful because we have what the futurist Alvin Toffler described in the 70s as, future shock. When too many things change at the same time, that creates an uncomfortable degree of uncertainty. So we have geopolitics, climate change, AI, change of the labor market, and who knows what else. And of course, you also have changing social norms. That also creates uncertainty because, what is the purpose of a social model that's very prescriptive, like, man, woman, getting married, having children? That gives a lot of certainty. And just creating alternate social models creates a lot more uncertainty in addition to all the others. So without putting blame to them, it's just to explain why suddenly you have less handrails to walk you through history. So there's two ways you can deal with that. One is you create an illusion of certainty by saying, let's just go back to the past, because the past is very certain. Or you propose visions of how to navigate this and how to get a better outcome than what we have in the present. And you see our society is either doing the first, so you have political parties, populist parties very often run on a historical narrative because it creates certainty. And then you have, on the other hand, those that would like to propose a vision but haven't reached yet a level, I would say, that's super convincing. And so I think, with the futurist glasses on, the political landscape is a very classical expression of fear of the future when a lot of changes are occurring simultaneously.
And of course, some of those responses, the creating an illusion of certainty by annexing stories of the past or creating visions of how to navigate and create a better future, these themselves are being deployed in ways by politicians in ways that actually create more uncertainty because they're polarizing parts of the populace. Some people are proposing visions of the future that are deeply divisive, for instance, and that's adding, I guess, to this climate of future shock, this sense that we're living through times of really unprecedented uncertainty. You've mentioned already that one of the things that's obviously on your horizon that you're looking at in terms of improbable futures, that is part of maybe a kind of global uncertainty as well, is the way in which war itself is being conducted. And it's being affected by shifts in global order, technological developments. You've mentioned biology as a military domain as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about how warfare is being changed by political shifts, by technological developments?
So the thinking about the future of war starts really in the 19th century, because of technology. So before that, I remember the other day somebody said to me, how come the Romans never thought about the future of war? Well, because technology was more or less going to always be the same. So all you could do was develop strategies and use surprise, but the nature of war itself would not change. So of course, now what we see also as a historical trend is it's true we have a higher number of conflicts today, but conflict is also becoming less lethal. And that sounds perhaps cynical because there's still a lot of people dying in conflict. I don't have the answer, but one of the hypotheses is that many weapons are becoming more precise. Especially Western countries have a tendency to move further and further into high technology warfare, highly precise warfare. And not every country does that. And of course, that doesn't mean that other actors will continue to use, let's say, more old school methods, which is why future of war is also hard to predict. People tend to overestimate the impact of technology on the nature of war and underestimate the human factor. What I mean by that is human creativity in using a certain technology. Drones are a very good example. They were not developed for military purposes, but of course you have the first conflict in Ukraine now where both sides are going, okay, wait, this could be a delivery method also for other things, right? So when we're looking further into the future, And that's why, some people saying, the future of war will be drones. Well, the future of war is no longer the future because that's already here. So drones are already part of the future landscape. But we do have, of course, things like hypersonic weapons, weapons that are very difficult. So more the air component will become more pronounced. You also have manipulating feelings and thoughts. That goes beyond propaganda because you can actually manipulate feelings, of course, also with physical means, with sound and so forth. So that's why cognitive warfare is now something that we're all talking about, also understanding the brain better, neurology. And climate change will also change the future of war. So we know that increasing water temperature makes submarines harder to detect in some waters and easier to detect in others. Due to moisture, air visibility on the oceans will be impaired. So let's say, especially maritime warfare will be impacted because you can't see as well. Drones, for instance, are also affected by weather. Extreme weather events that we will have more in the future will limit the utility of drones. So these are all things that people aren't necessarily thinking about, but it's a very convoluted landscape. And then most importantly, the one question that nobody can really answer, but it's an important one, is how will humans behave in a conflict? The human factor, the will to fight, but also resilience, how creative they are, how fast they respond, how fast do they find a solution, how do they work around existing obstacles. That is actually the big unknown. And when you look at Ukraine, it's still a very decisive component of warfare. So I'm constantly stressing this aspect because people, I think, are rushing to the new tech because, of course, it's shiny and you can look at it. But at the end of the day, war is a human phenomenon between human beings, and how they deal with it will determine the outline. Perhaps to add on also on location, domains. In NATO, we call this now multi-domain operations. It's a fancy term, but basically it means war can happen in several places at the same time. So rather than just being on land and on air, we could also imagine cyberspace, space, and all the other domains I just mentioned. And I think this is something that's a bit complex because it means you have to have people that can think across these different domains simultaneously, integrate, talk to each other. So our systems are not ready for a 360-degree warfare, so to speak.
Yes, really important point, that thinking across different domains and having to understand how humans work. So all of that psychological analysis, as well as technological expertise, political understanding, all of this in the mix. And I heard people talking very much about grey war as being present now and something that we might see much more of in the future, where the blend between war and not war, between civilian and military activity, war that's conducted through crops or supply chains, not just through tanks and drones that are militarized. Can you say a little bit more about this grey war?
Yeah. I think it's a better term than hybrid war because, first of all, the NATO section said stop using the word hybrid. Let's just call it what it is. It's sabotage or it's gray zone warfare, but hybrid almost has a positive connotation at this point because of the hybrid cars. But now war is on a spectrum. If you think back to classical wars like, 19th century, the Battle of Waterloo, you knew where you would meet, when you would meet, who would act. Everybody would wear uniforms, so it was clear who was from which side. And then whoever lost the whole war. So a battle actually ended up deciding the whole war. Today, we no longer have a declaration of war. I think if at all, then 1991, the attack on Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait, maybe that was the last time there was an actual declaration of war. Everything else is either you don't announce it or you announce it as, as we had in Ukraine, as a special operation. So it's not actually a war. So there's a lot more grayness to it. Gray now in the sense of not clear, is it war, is it not war, which also for legal purposes has an impact, right? Because we have a whole body of law that defines what's allowed, what's not allowed in war. We saw that already in the Crimea occupation, the little green man. What does that mean? It means uniforms that aren't declared uniforms. That is the purpose of uniforms. Uniforms have a purpose in international law, so you can really say he or she's a combatant and he or she's not. And so Russia has been playing with that actually for a considerable amount of time. So gray zone warfare is operating in this gray zone, not clearly stating this is war or this is peace. So undertaking negative actions, things that will hurt your opponent, but under the radar of actually being a full-on war. So that could be all kinds of sabotage. So infrastructure, attacks on railways, on electricity grids, even things that create societal discontent, like disinformation campaigns, setting fire to an IKEA. I think we had that in a Nordic country. Or in Germany, you had people putting foam into the exhaust of expensive cars. It was supposed to look like these were environmentalists to create societal dissent. That turned out to be a Russian operation as well. So espionage as well. All of these partly classical tools of the book. But then, of course, we have new ones, cyber attacks and so forth. They're all part of this larger body of international law. Doesn't say that is war, but actually it has the same effect of war, which is to demoralize your opponent, to influence your opponent's decision-making to your advantage. And that we see Russia, but also China, they're very skilled at that, and we are not.
And it'd be interesting to think about why are we not, and who the we is there, NATO, individual countries within NATO as well. And just to probe a little bit more, you've talked about the fact that we need to do different kinds of thinking for this so that we get into our improbable futures and that we start to find the things that we're not thinking about. But what in practice does that mean? What kinds of foresight practices do we need to adopt? What kinds of futures thinking do we need to be going for?
Working for NATO means that we are tasked to think about a negative future all the time. So I think I want to premise that because not for everybody this kind of thinking will be useful. Let's say you work in development or you work in education, then you're obviously going to focus on a positive future that you want to achieve. For a military organization, the positive future is always stability and peace, but the military is tasked with preventing a war through deterrence, or when it happens, winning it as fast as possible, ideally. So we are in the business of anticipating a war, as in when it's going to happen, who's going to be the actors, with what means, and where. Where, as in which domains, but also, specifically, which part of the world. So when we think about that, we have this paradox that we know while we're conducting this research that we will be wrong. So we're going to stack all the probabilities and the trends and everything that we all see, and we build that. So we know we will be wrong because an analysis of the last 155 years of thinking about the future of war show us that we tend to be almost always wrong, with the exception of location. So at least we know where, but we're not even so good at saying who. I mean, yeah, we know, let's say Russia, but who in Russia? Is it going to be the military, or is it going to be guerrilla forces, or is it going to be spies? I mean, so we can get quite a lot wrong. But you have to start with the probable. That's why it's good to have a division of labor. So you have NATO headquarters, but also ACT, Allied Command Transformation, thinking about the probable. And then once you have established that, you say, okay, and what else is there? What are we not thinking about? That is the only way you can actually prepare for the unexpected, by pushing your thinking further. But for that, first you line out what you expect and you say, okay, and what do we not expect? And it's not, so there's a creative dimension to it, because you have to be disruptive and you think outside of what you're expecting. So one trick is write down everything that you expect, and then we leave it on the wall, we leave it on the paper, and we say, everything that was mentioned here cannot be repeated in whatever we're going to do next, because it has to be the opposite or something else. And then we have a team of researchers that are tasked with looking for weak signals all the time. I was just having this conversation this morning with my colleague who's very good at this, Roderick Parks. And I said to him, I keep being asked, how are you particularly creative in finding weak signals? And he said, I'm good at it because I'm bored a lot. And I thought that was funny, but actually, there is a dimension. Why is boredom important? Is because the brain hates boredom, and when it's bored, it will entertain itself in a variety of ways. And listening to weird podcasts, picking up a weird book, listening to somebody you've never spoken to, I think is a good way to get closer to the actual state. Even when we do all of that, war will still not be 100% what we predicted. That's because the other side, whoever they are, they will watch what we're thinking and doing, and they will actively try to surprise us. So that is the nature of the beast. And that's why I think part of the reason I'm stressing that is because I want to also inject a little bit of humility in everybody's understanding of the future of war. We're sketching it out. It's like knowing we're flying to Mars. We're not exactly sure what we're going to find there. We can still prepare, but it will not be 100% what we thought it was going to be.
Absolutely. So you've mentioned boredom. And I think one of the other words that we might throw into the conversation here is imagination. So when futures thinkers talk about their practice, they sometimes refer to the 3 horizons framework, thinking about the different levels of thinking that we can do and the different tools we have. So the first horizon involves analysing the status quo. The second horizon involves exploring emerging innovations. And then the third horizon involves using your imaginations about these possibilities that don't currently exist. And I suppose the question that I've got for you, which maybe links back to why aren't we always very good at this, is Boredom and imagination are not typically the tools that we reach to when we want to fight. They're not the things that have authority, that carry weight in a decision-making space. So how do policymakers respond to the imaginative, the creative, the improbable thinking? Is it hard to get people to take that seriously rather than the probable futures and the stuff that we can see?
Yes, 100%. Every research outfit I know, or every futurist outfit I know is facing that challenge. Because, first of all, policymaking is, of course, the art of the possible, right? So they want to work, they want to make decisions, they want to implement decisions, they want to move forward. And of course, it's very present day oriented, or maybe if you're lucky, it's the next few months. Policymakers want to see results of their decisions. So then you come and say, well, there's a low probability that something might happen in a few years and you might not even be in office anymore. So it's harder to get them engaged. Now, there are a few tricks. First of all, you need to give them the problem with a solution at the same time. And that is something I think many futurists struggle with because they're in the business of Cassandra. So they're alerting to a danger, but then leave the problem at the decision maker's door. And the decision maker, like any other human being, doesn't like to just be challenged. So there is a good chance that Cassandra complex is a psychological phenomenon where you just don't listen when you're being warned. So you want to avoid the Cassandra complex by saying, hold on, I have bad news, but I have a way to fix it. So that is definitely deliver the solution. Also, one type of scenario is the cost of inaction. So you can write a scenario that shows them you might not want to do what I recommended, but if you do nothing, this is what's going to happen. So you bring the future to life through scenarios, which brings me to the second important point. How do you deliver this future? What does it look like? Every bureaucracy, NATO included, will have a preference for a neutral, unemotional, not creative report, because that's the nature of Western bureaucracy. But the future doesn't exist, so you have to psychologically work around that. You have to make it acceptable. And the best way to do that is by packing it into a creative outlet. So that is, of course, a scenario. Some of our scenarios, they are written like a story. They start with an actual event. Officer Robinson stood on the bridge of the USS so-and-so, stared out into the night and saw this and this. Immediately, you will be drawn into the story, much more than if it said, we cannot exclude that by the year so-and-so will have this and that. So we write it as a story, but we provide footnotes for where the story comes from. And of course, we end an element to the story, how the story could have turned out differently if decision makers had acted earlier. And then there's many other creative ways you can package the story. So we did an AI film last year that you saw when you were at the conference. We also published a comic that I think you and I will talk about. Now for the Munich Security Conference, I prepared a newspaper, the newspaper from the future that people picked up because, well, first of all, newspapers, they're no longer in paper form. They're actually now an attractive thing to hold again. And it was dated 2031. It had, news from the future. So catch them by surprise, be creative, use your imagination and think about the reader or the decision maker more than about your own message. Like think about the psychology. How do you get there? I think that's something that's very important and that we cannot neglect.
Absolutely. And you talked about the fact that the human element is always the very decisive factor in conflict and also one of the factors that's hardest to predict. But one of the ways in which you can predict it or at least model it in all sorts of different manifestations is to story it and to put humans in dealing with these emergent technologies or this emerging scenario or whatever. And then you see people reacting as people and playing this out. So you've mentioned we've both mentioned the fact that one of the things that you've published is this graphic novel called NATO 2099, where you are really harnessing the power of imagination to aid futures thinking. It marks 75 years since NATO's foundation, but it also looks 75 years ahead into its future. So it takes us into a world that's both recognizable and unrecognizable. And it immerses us in sort of a possible, improbable, but plausible future version of our own world. Can you start just by giving our listeners an outline of the plot?
So the plot it starts with a researcher from NATO Defense College traveling to the moon on a moon shuttle. She encounters their SAC space, Supreme Allied Commander space, and they have a chat about, wars that happened 30, 40 years earlier. They arrive on the moon for a big summit NATO is having with other countries. And then, of course, a disaster strikes. It comes to a conflict on Earth, and they need to solve this problem while they're at the summit. So that's, without spoiling it, that is the plot.
Yes, and we'll talk a little bit more about the fact that you dive into a history that hasn't happened yet in the 2050s,
yes, exactly.
As well as a sort of bridge. But do you want to say a little bit more about why this graphic novel came about?
So I started thinking about the fact that NATO's 75th anniversary was coming up, and that we as a college should contribute something, because everybody was going to contribute something. I thought first about the limitations. We're a small team. Also, it was quite late in the game. It was already summer 23. What can we do? And also, what can we do that nobody else has done? So we cannot write a huge history of NATO. Others are doing that. And then I remembered that the French military was working with science fiction authors. So I started thinking, 2099, in 75 years, that's not strategic foresight. That's too far away. So we would have to divert to science fiction, which can write about this distant future. And then I started thinking a step further, and I thought, okay, we have a good science fiction story. Let's turn it into a graphic novel, because that is a format that is beautiful, attractive, and also completely at odds with what people expect from NATO. So you catch the reader by surprise by, NATO, by giving NATO a face that he or she has never seen before. So it was a contribution. It was also our brand, so to speak, to think about the future rather than the past. And as it so happens, NATO turned 75. We wanted to think 75 years in the future. Luckily, that turned out to be the year 2099, which is also a good title.
Absolutely. And it's this new spin on NATO. And I think one of the things that it does for readers is we're all reading about something that actually we're part of, that matters to us. So it's drawing us into our own future. It's not simply an abstract taking us to 2099 and having it play out for a load of other people who we have no connection with. So that new spin on NATO is really nice. As I've said, one of the things that I really enjoyed about this graphic novel as a historian is the fact that it takes us into the future, but it does so via the history of the sea wars of the 1940s, this intervening history, which then characters recount and remember in historical but also actually very personal ways as one of the tools in which they're using to try and then predict what might happen next. So they're drawing parallels and contrast. And I wonder, what was your reasoning for starting this way, for starting by plunging us into these sea wars?
So the contribution, so the way the graphic novel was devised was that we had a call on our website, and we asked science fiction authors from all over NATO to hand in a contribution that answered three questions. What does NATO look like in 75 years, in 2099? What challenges has it overcome? What challenges is it facing at this point in time? So from the outset, the question about the years between today and 2099 was part of the project. Now, the science fiction authors, we had 40 contributions in total. They were completely free to do whatever they wanted. We just took these contributions and we stacked them, and we found patterns. And in the challenges that NATO overcame, we found one theme that was recurring, and it was maritime. So some type of maritime conflicts. They were not identical, but you had, things ranging from underwater warfare to, of course, freedom of navigation issues. So we grouped them together and we called them the sea wars, because we felt the collective sees something that is maritime in the future. So that was the reason for exactly the sea wars. Now, why did I decide to ask the authors about the past, right? Or what's the future past? Precisely because of what you said, I wanted to create continuity between today and then. And so it is hard for us to imagine 75 years into the future. If you just parachuted into it, you might see no connection to it. And it's very important that the reader always feels like he or she is part of this future. They can see how it relates to them directly, which is also why, incidentally, you asked me earlier, what is one of the ways you can make this more acceptable, is that you link it back to the person or to the time that the reader is living in. In scenarios, we do that by showing them what could have been done today to avoid this. In the graphic novel, we did it by telling the story that happened between 2099 and today.
Absolutely. And that sort of recounting, the sort of actual intergenerational recounting of my personal experience during the sea wars and do you remember that, is very reminiscent also of some of the conversations that we've all had ourselves with family members from a previous generation. What was your role in? Do you remember that? What was it like to live through the Cold War? That kind of thing. So it does feel very, very relatable. I suppose one of the other things that worked fantastically about the sea wars is that they help get the reader into this understanding of grey war, where there are non-state actors, a handful of very disruptive terrorist type figures, not simply armed states clashing against each other, using this sort of tech, no rules, no law, lots of chaos. So getting us into that scenario, which then is very useful for the scenario that's playing out in 2099, where there is actually the zone of uncertainty, as it were, is space, right? So you're not on the moon for no reason. You're on the moon because space is at risk. Do you want to say a bit about that, about the sort of the zone of interest in the 2099 element?
So the moon has two purposes in this story, like you rightly said. One is a storytelling dimension. So, the very first science fiction, if you want, they go to space, or in fact, they just go to a different place. But the space, the moon, Francis Bacon or whatever, you have 16th century novels about the moon. At the time, it was not so much because they thought that space travel is going to be a thing, but because you want to write about a different time without upsetting the political leaders. So you say, well, it's actually not on this planet, it's somewhere else. So there is a storytelling dimension to it. And it helps the reader to zoom out of the present. If I say it's actually not on this planet, it's on a different planet. But of course, it helped that we had space popping up all over the contributions as well. So in addition to maritime, these were the two domains that were so prominent in all these contributions. Space, because we have several actors really increasingly operating in space, not just for commercial, but also for military purposes. Obviously the United States, but also China. We have the private sector, Starlink and all that, increasingly being in space. And we have a return to, well, I wouldn't say space race, but after decades of not really caring about space has also returned as an area for research and just venturing out. Hence, this desire to go to Mars and perhaps to see if we can meet energetic means via solar panels in space, or the use of regolith, the lunar soil, so to speak, for economic purposes. So there's a host of reasons why space is suddenly so much more prominent in our thinking, why it holds a lot of potential, both positive but also negative. And so, that is why a large portion of the graphic novel takes place in space.
And both space and the sea, the maritime zone, help us wrestle with things that are actually happening now, underwater cables being cut, as you say, space competition ramping up. But of course, there are lots of elements of the graphic novel which do take us into a world well beyond where we're at the moment. And one of those is the use of AI, the sort of integral use of AI, and this very science fiction machine called the War Predictor. And I loved the metatextual nature of the War Predictor. So this is a graphic novel which is exploring how do you predict war and what happens when you involve AI, and is AI actually a help or a hindrance? That's a big question that your characters wrestle with in predicting war, and can AI sometimes precipitate war by predicting it, and so on. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the War Predictor in the graphic novel and the kinds of reflections that you were hoping to prompt about, I suppose, the relationship between human decision making and AI technology.
I love that you spotted that, because I think that not everybody understood that. But it's pretty meta, that basically the novel questions itself in a way. So working on the future of war and fully knowing the limits of the discipline with or without AI, we really wanted to highlight, in the graphic novel, you have AI also playing some positive roles, right? So you have, for instance, one of the main characters, Frankie, she's socially awkward. and she struggles with social interaction, and the AI helps her navigate that. So it's not a blanket statement, against AI, the killer machine, but it does highlight the nuance. And it also highlights the war predictor, the war predictor is a machine that, as the name indicates, predicts war, and NATO relies on it to think about war. But there is a moment when the machine makes a very definite statement. And I don't want to spoiler what happens next, but it really leaves the reader with a question of if that's such a good idea, because being human ultimately means acting in a surprising way, both good and bad, and having not understood, I think this is an important point I want to stress, conflict research, in all areas of conflict research. We've made a lot of progress in the last 70 years, but I will say we need to learn a lot more about why humans go to war, how they go to war, when do they decide to no longer fight. And it's a call for humility to say, we should not have the illusion that we have understood war. I think that is the main message. And as long as we are humble about it, we actually have a real chance of preventing it and also of solving it. So I think it's the hubris of thinking you've understood it when you haven't understood it that this machine warns us of.
Absolutely. And I suppose it's the hubris of thinking that we have predictive powers, right? That humility of understanding that what we're all still trying to do endlessly is keep working it out.
Exactly.
And the novel ends on a cliffhanger. As you say, it's not black and white around the war predictor. It's not clear cut whether the war predictor is a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's going to play a big role in the future beyond 2099 or whether it won't, whether the threat of war is going to be realised or whether the calls for diplomacy and peace that you see throughout the novel are going to be successful. And I guess I wanted to ask a little bit about that. So in the narrative about the sea wars, and then as the war starts to loom and the threats build in 2099 as well, as that part of the novel, that future element of the novel develops, there are lots of calls for peace. And I was just wondering if you think that in our futures thinking, in imagining our improbable scenarios, whether we visualize peace and peacemaking and what it takes to get there or not go to war in as much depth as we visualize, what does war actually look like, or what could it look like, or how would we win it if it happened?
I love that question. And unfortunately, the answer is we don't do it enough. But that goes to a larger problem we're having right now. And I touched on it earlier when I talked about developing a positive vision for the future. So I think in Western societies at the moment, we're very good at telling you, every single listener can list 10 things that he or she doesn't want to happen in the future for themselves, but also for society, right? We don't want war, we don't want climate change, we don't want polarization and so forth. Now, the problem is that that's not enough to create a positive future. In fact, it's the opposite. Because the positive future or a better future is created by first imagining it in detail. And the human being has the capacity to imagine a future in detail, even with elements that they've never encountered, to the point where on the brain scan, it is almost indistinguishable from something you've actually encountered. So this is the power of the brain, imagination, and all that. So when we develop a very clear vision of where do we want to be, who do we want to be in 2099, then the brain does something that, now is pop culturally called manifesting or whatever, but the brain does something interesting. When you have a very clear vision of where you want to be, it's almost like the brain pins this image to the forefront. And then number one, is faster at ignoring things that contradict it. In other words, you are more likely to persist in the event of a failure because your brain says the failure is the error, not the vision. So I'm just going to keep trying until I get there. You're going to dedicate resources to making this future possible. You're going to become more tolerant to frustration on the way to that vision. And of course, you're more likely to get there because if you keep trying, you're likelier to get there than if you don't. Now, Western societies used to have a clear vision of the future. And, not every generation has to completely come up from scratch with one. I will argue that for 100 years or so, we had more or less the same future, which was a certain degree of economic well-being, welfare, rule of law, democracy, raising life expectancy, etc., etc. And now we've reached a point where we have several elements colliding. You have, on the one hand, other actors like China and Russia having a very clear vision for the future that we don't like, but they have one. We have all this uncertainty created by all the developments we touched on earlier. And then our old future is no longer valid because we have reached almost all those milestones. don't get me wrong, I'm fully aware that, we don't live in paradise and there's plenty of things that are not going perfectly. But compared to 100 years ago, we've crossed actually quite a lot of things off our list. And where is the new future? And this is a political job to come up with it, as in obviously in consultation and so forth with people. But this is, I think, a classical job for politicians to help devise. Now we've created a lot. Who do we want to be in 25 years, in 30 years, in 75 years? And that is the vacuum that many people are feeling. And we also see, by the way, in surveys that voters of populist parties tend to be particularly strong on fear of the future. So one of the ways that you meet that fear of the future is by proposing a vision that says, this is how we handle the future. So I think all of these are common, together the result of a missing future, of a missing positive future that we need to formulate.
Yes, that's a fantastic explanation there of the power of storytelling and the power of imagination. And as you say, what we might today call manifesting as well, or what in our project, I suppose we call visualizing, this idea that you can't build a future that you haven't visualized, that you haven't pictured,
yes.
But you can if you have. And if you
can I just interject there? Because I think the visual dimension is so important. Humans think in pictures, right? So it's called episodic memory and episodic foresight, because it's an episode. It's like a movie in your head. It is a film. So the visualization dimension, it sounds like, oh yeah, graphics or whatever, but it's key. It's even more important in the 21st century because we have the means to actually bring things to life through pictures. That was a lot harder to do in the past. But yeah, we have to use the tools to do that, 100%.
Absolutely. And you see that happening within your graphic novel. In the wake of the sea wars, there is some great storytelling around a kind of a coming together of nations and a finding of peaceful solutions and this optimism for a future vision, which then obviously goes wrong again. So the power of stories, the power of imagination, the power of vision and visualizing and images, all of these things can be harnessed in graphic novels and, as you say, these newspapers of the future, that kind of thing. And I just wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how your graphic novel has been received. What have people made of it and what can that tell us about its value as a tool in strategic foresight?
So, we took a bit of a risk when we decided to go ahead with the graphic novel. Luckily, my boss, he's a Danish 3-star. When I went to him, this was really actually quite an interesting moment because I went to him and I said, so I have an idea. I want to ask science fiction authors and I will turn it into a graphic novel. Also, I've never worked with science fiction authors or indeed graphic novel artists. So I have no clue what can go wrong, but probably something's going to go wrong. And he still said, that sounds like a fascinating idea. Let's do it. Which also shows, risk-taking can have super interesting effects. We did inform NATO headquarters that we were planning on doing that, and they loved the idea from the start. But in public diplomacy, are now called Office for Strategic Communication, they're always interested in publishing something that is surprising and different. When it came out, the reaction was, I'm going to say, enthusiastic from so many different quarters, which just shows that I think why headquarters liked it was because they thought it's going to be particularly attractive for younger people. And NATO struggles a little bit with reaching younger people. I never thought that. I thought graphic novel as a format is so unique that also older people or whatever middle-aged people, everybody literally can be interested in it. And also we used a real person. It's not an AI product. It really is a human being that drew it. And I wanted it to have the classical feel of a graphic novel. In a military committee, they really appreciate it because they said it's a message of hope. It just shows that the future won't be easy, but there is a future. And of course, we also had younger people. We sent it to ministers. I mean, it's all around very positive reaction. And of course, I'm very happy about that because, we decided to do something very creative, very unusual. And people saw that and appreciated it.
And as you said earlier, it's very unlikely that a strategic report would ever get that kind of response, right? That sort of engagement, that enthusiasm, that emotional as well as intellectual response.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
And when we've had guests on the podcast before who've talked about useful fiction, so I'm thinking of Peter W. Singer and August Cole and some people we've interviewed as well who've been doing some creative fiction, some useful fiction for the Royal Air Force in the UK, they've talked about as well that reach, that ability to engage all sorts of people who wouldn't normally sit down to read a strategic foresight report or a white paper or whatever it might be. So it absolutely has that reach. And the visuals are very much part of that, you're right. Yes, I've got a copy at home and my children have been flicking their way through it. And it feels very much like the kind of thing that they would pick up, from a shelf in a bookshop. So based on that experience, are you keen to harness speculative fiction, useful fiction, science fiction more in the future as you continue to research and brief on future security challenges and opportunities?
Of course. I mean, I have a few other crazy ideas. One is actually not crazy. We just did it this weekend for the Munich Security Conference. I took my team's what-if scenarios and turned them into a newspaper from the future that we distributed, and it got a lot of attention. Also because, newspapers are no longer a thing, so people actually pay more attention to them. And, it's set in 2031. And it was really great fun because, we have all these serious what-if scenarios, but we added some from, the biological forefront, for instance, in the newspaper is called the North Star, because NATO's symbol is a compass. We thought, the North Star shows you direction. It kind of echoes the NATO identity. We had an article on an AI that allows us to talk to elephants and figure out how they're doing in their zoo there in Munich. So that was a huge success, and we definitely will explore that further, or continue doing actually that. Something I want to explore, I had a conversation with the NATO Science and Technology Organization, is to perhaps do a science fiction film, an AI-generated little film that allows us to bring to life technology and embed it into a story. So, this is the other interesting thing, is that the graphic novel, but also the film that we showed at the conference, I feel like innovation encourages more innovation, because people are convinced and then they're like, okay, let's try this somewhere else. So can we do something else? So the short answer is absolutely, we want to continue exploring that. One thing that I think is also interesting is a game, perhaps board game or another kind of game that shows you different pathways of decision making. I mean, I'm not going to say that there is no limit, because there is, but I think there's definitely several other tools we can explore and play with.
Absolutely. And I might talk to you more about gaming in future. We're thinking about a project about gaming peace, as lots of other people do as well, but thinking about the way in which that immersive storytelling activity can be a fantastic way of visualizing different futures, partly through visualizing the past. And I say that as a Roman historian. Dr. Florence Gaub, thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation. As an aside, one of the things that I've loved taking away from the conference in October is my NATO umbrella, and it's obviously got some images from the graphic novel in it. So when it's been raining, which has been a lot recently here in Scotland, I go out sheltering under NATO, and that's always fun.
I love that.
And the wind hasn't taken it yet, which is a good sign, I think.
Good.
So
I love the metaphor here.
So thank you for that, but thank you above all for a really fascinating conversation about different approaches to futures thinking and the way in which we can not only detect these weak signals, but then creatively storytell around these improbable futures in ways that actually might help us to build visions of a more positive future that we can really actively then work towards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really interesting, really fun. Thank you.
And thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We have more episodes coming up as we continue to explore different visualizations of both war and peace in different contexts. So please keep tuning in. If you'd like to support our project, please do share our podcast with others in your networks. You can join the conversation further by following us on social media, or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you for listening.